cover the main challenges, and in the context of the ongoing transition, what perhaps could be the measures, or what could be some of the, not that I have answers or solutions, so to speak, but what could be the areas which need focus and attention. Let's put it in that context. So to begin with, distribution is saddled with legacy issues. We all keep hearing about losses of distribution companies, and the numbers are always in lakhs of crores. They are not small numbers. If you want a rough estimate, it will be usually 2% of the GDP. That is the kind of bailout that we will be looking at very soon. I'm sure it will be the next bailout. So this is the number we look at when we talk about past losses. So there's a huge legacy issue that distribution companies struggle with. The second sort of challenge that distribution companies deal with can be classified as what you can call a regulatory and governance challenge. Basically, you cannot have regular tariff revisions in certain states. In states where you do have regular tariff revisions, even then you end up with large regulatory assets. Technical and commercial losses. This has been the discussion around distribution for over 3 decades now, and you still have the same numbers, and you still have little faith in those numbers. So that debate continues. And poor planning, which is like at the crux of many of the issues that ail the distribution sector. Basically, distribution is seldom able to come with any rigorous and credible plan in terms of its requirements, in terms of its demand, and the supply options that it chooses vis-a-vis that demand. And that is one of the significant operation of DISCOM, which is very, very weak in our country, and that is something I'll talk about more. And then there is a major political aspect of the challenge or issue, if you may like. And there are again various facets to this political challenge. Usually when people talk about distribution related issues and the political challenges around, the simplistic thing is, oh, we give free electricity to farmers and some consumers, and but it's not as simple as that. Agriculture estimation, agriculture tariff is certainly a very important issue that is at the heart of distribution's finances, but that's not the only issue. The other issue which does not often get talked about and perhaps adequately looked into is the tension between the center and states when it comes to electricity distribution. Both have very different agendas, both have very different policy instruments, and that sort of drives the distribution company in a very different directions. I think Ajay Shankarji touched upon it in the morning. But so the central government can be very strong in terms of the line it takes, in terms of what the electricity cost should be, what the tariffs should be, what should be the frequency at which the electricity tariffs can be set. And it tries to impose this on a state with very different political reality, and the state will definitely not fall in line with some of these diktats, and that leads to a very vicious cycle of revenues not being commensurate with the costs, and even whatever the distribution company recovers is not able to use it efficiently, and so on and so forth. So this tension between the lack of policy coherence between the center and the state leads to many suboptimal decisions in terms of policy and regulatory outcomes, and that is something I'll talk about in a little more detail. So, and there have been, it's not, in the last 2 decades at least, there have been certain important positive changes. The most important one being, as Shankarji mentioned in the opening, is electrification. Now we have almost, one can say, very close to universal electrification in the country. So that's a very, very big step forward, and that has huge implications for how electricity demand will shape in the coming years. Solarization of agriculture, as Ajit also touched upon in his presentation, is a very, very important change in terms of very important positive change, because it gives a huge demand lever to the distribution companies, and it gives daytime supply to the agricultural users. So it's again a very important big positive change that has happened. The reducing costs of solar and other renewable energy sources, that is something we have been discussing, and I'll come back to it. That is something, again, a very positive change that has happened. And perhaps it is because of this reducing cost trajectory of solar and storage, one tends to feel that the transition as far as electricity is concerned is essentially going to be economically easier. It seems as if, the transition to renewables is essentially a cost-cutting mechanism and therefore should lead to lower tariffs, but that is hardly the case, and that's where all the other challenges come into picture. So the first challenge that comes from a distribution sector point of view is that if you look at the electricity tariff or electricity cost, 80% of it is generation cost, and that again has a lot of legacy element to it. Today, either you have distribution companies saddled with power that they are backing down and it's very high cost and surplus power, or you have distribution companies who don't have adequate power tied up with them, and therefore they are buying through market, and therefore they are subject to the market variation. So in both cases, you have very high cost of power purchase, which is not optimal, which is not rational. Then what you were just saying about hydro and pump storage being a very good, which is theoretically absolutely right. But in terms of balancing RE, if one looks at all the new capacity options, whether it is new coal, new hydro, new pump storage, it's very expensive. And even beyond being expensive, it's unreliable. The hydro especially, like we haven't seen any credible hydro projects being constructed, the tariffs not being reflective of what the costs were proposed at the time when the projects were started, and the power becoming available within even 2 to 3 year delay period from the time. So there is huge uncertainty, and that costs are very, very large. So if one is thinking about hydro as a viable option for balancing RE, I don't see that as possible in the at least next decade, in which time you would have lost the need for any, because the rate at which the transition is happening. And there is lack of policy coherence even in that aspect. So on one end, for example, if you take the coal sector, for example, in the last 5 years, the base price of coal has not increased. Last 3 years, at least, it has not increased. But the kind of taxes, levies, and other charges that have come up, the landed cost of coal has gone up very significantly. And that has jeopardized so many contracts that power sector has signed. So, this is again this is central government, two arms doing different things which don't lead to a coherent kind of action. So basically, a lot of tariff increase that is now happening is because of coal-related change in law, coal-related, then there is suboptimal coal capacity in terms of the planning, in terms of its transport, and so many other aspects. So basically, there is lack of coherence between the different arms of the energy sector, and those costs pile upon distribution, because ultimately that's where you recover the money from. Another major policy dissonance is between a very we are seeing so much of innovation in technical aspects, technology-related aspects, but from policy perspective, there has been such a narrow perspective of only one solution, which is privatization or franchising. For the last 3 decades, as far as distribution sector is concerned, there has been no other idea in terms of improving distribution performance. And even this idea has repeatedly resulted in no real benefit. The few examples of privatization that we have not really demonstrated in any credible way that it can lead to either better service delivery or better cost recovery. Both dimensions it has not delivered, and yet that is the only policy solution that comes up through even the present draft of the Electricity Amendment Act that is being proposed. Again, harps on the same solution. In fact, that is going to make things more difficult for the transition from distribution sector point of view, because unfortunately, the areas that are cherry-picked for privatization are the better revenue-making circles of the distribution, and which are actually doing much better service delivery, and there is little to improve in terms of either network or service delivery. But the revenue loss will be major for the distribution company if these pockets get privatized. So again, you see complete lack of coherence in terms of policy objectives and the sector requirements as far as this area is concerned. And there is a very top-down approach as well. Basically, the center seems to become more and more impatient with distribution and state sector not. So you can see that the tone in the changes is more about dictating the terms, making policies binding, making regulatory commission much more tied down in terms of the levers that it can use to regulate the sector, or coming up with diktats such as the distribution companies cannot buy power if they don't clear dues. Which I understand the financial discipline aspect of it, and perhaps I would also say that it is necessary. But it gives you a sense of there is a very hierarchical now approach to things, and there is a more centralization, which is not very healthy in a subject which is for which you need policy coherence between state and center. So it can become very adversarial. And so these are all the challenges. And of course, while I mentioned the regulator, there is a big regulatory institutional accountability challenge as well. And both center and state have no coherent view in terms of how they look at the institution again. So center, for example, through the APTEL order, it is basically trying to use the institution to have a very repeated and frequent tariff increase. That seems like the primary role that the regulator is given under this, whereas the state sees it more as a vehicle for basically delaying the tariff increase or doing selective changes to the tariff at different points of time. So basically there is no coherence in terms of the institutional and governance framework that distribution sector needs, and that has its own implications. Plus the reducing space for intervention is again. So if you look at all these issues in the context of the impending transition, it paints a very discomforting picture, because what is perhaps going to unfold is that the targets, the renewable energy capacity addition targets are extremely ambitious, and if one doesn't follow them, there will be other implications. If one follows them, there will be other implications. In both implications, the distribution company is going to financially suffer. And unless and until we come up with a framework which puts risks of capacity addition to where they are due, because right now the distribution company is saddled with an undue share of the risks in terms of all the capacity addition that takes place. So because it is traditionally the entity that has contracted all the baseload capacity, it is the one which is saddled with all those high cost power contracts. And because the open access regime in our country has evolved such that it doesn't really encourage long-term open access. It lets consumers selectively take open access wherever it meets their demand, and it helps them to reduce their costs. This has very damaging effect on the distribution sector finances. So going forward, without a credible regime that will put the risks with players who are in the capacity to take those risks, distribution is likely to be saddled with a lot of costs that it will find very hard to no matter how much tariff you increase, it will not be. And if you do increase tariff beyond a level, the electrification related benefits that you would like to see will suffer, especially in states that are newly electrified and where you would like to see a robust demand growth. So this is the balancing act, and therefore basically subsidies are here to stay in one way or the other, and they will be needed, and there is no wishing them away under the impression that solar costs are dropping and storage costs are dropping, and therefore we can very soon have tariffs which are reflective of cost of supply. I think we are still, that time is still a little far away, and I'll stop in 2 minutes with the judge's last 2 points. The last 2 things I want to say is that another thing that has suffered with this myopic view of only privatization as the way to look at distribution is that there has been no innovation in terms of let's say PPAs, the power purchase contracts that the distribution, you still have the old 25-year-old contract for a new thermal power station. You have coal policies which tie up PPA very strongly, and without that you don't get coal allocations. You have another thing that will come up as Mr. Satya was mentioning about the land requirements, and now this large RE parks, solar parks, and huge land requirements. But we don't have any regime for social and environmental impact assessments of RE. That can lead to naturally there will be opposition. There could be issues, then there could be struggles related to this kind of land acquisition, and that is something I think the current policy space is not considering. And the fact that we haven't thought of any regulatory models beyond a cost plus and performance based, which has been extremely inadequate in terms of handling the distribution companies. Does not encourage innovation in any real way. So basically, there is a very big danger of locking in, like I said, because the distribution company doesn't do any rigorous job of its demand supply analysis. And hydro and pump storage could get pushed in this process as alternatives or important, important tools in terms of managing the RE transition. But they are very unlikely to deliver, and in the process, very significant environmental damage is perhaps inevitable if we go down this trajectory.
Thanks, Ashwini.